Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Feeding Curiosity. I'm your host, Erich Wenzel, as always. Today's episode, I wanted to explore where Feeding Curiosity has been, which is really me. And the whole overarching story of this is based around me doing 2 marathons. For the last year or so, we've only released one episode with the exception of the last 3 weeks. We've been going over the Arcane Season 2 deep dives. The reason for the lack thereof of content around podcasts in general has been the choice to take on the marathon. And I've done it twice, so 2023 and 2024. Part of the reason the podcasting world or podcasting has been going down to a crawl is very early on I decided that I needed to commit to an aggressive training cycle. And I felt that I couldn't spread myself thin in terms of making content, producing content, and holding a full-time job and training for a marathon. Something had to give. So making content was the one thing. Part of that is I was going through a transition. I have a new job, different career. So learning that, creating a whole new routine, and also I was repeating myself too much in the content world. That I needed to get new experiences, try a whole bunch of new things. I needed to go back into the lab, so to speak, and come back with new things to say. And so I think I've done that, basically. And now having done the marathon 2 times, and if you're a longtime follower of the show and things that I do on the website, you know that I've spent a lot of time working with wearables, working with performance, supplements, etc. I turned 30, and part of that was to see if I could take everything I've been absorbing and learning around performance and physical training and say, okay, I'm not an athlete, but could I turn myself into an amateur athlete with everything I'm doing and really apply that? I didn't have a coach. I used wearables and my own gut instinct to figure out how to do marathon, which is a crazy normal challenge. Adding in something like marathon training is no easy feat. The other part of that is, could I do something crazy in the sense that 20-year-old me never thought I'd do a marathon. So 30-year-old me for sure would not have been even feasible. And so I did it. And early on, when you do these kinds of training, this is the first 5-mile run, this is the first 10-mile run, this is the first half marathon, so on and so forth. So everything is a new PR, no matter what. And I think running, in a lot of ways, is one of those things that you can see your performance really easily, right? Are you doing faster pace, higher intensity, right? Or are you going further? And it really gives you this kind of juxtaposition to be like, okay, can you adapt, whatever that means? And different changes as a more weightlifting focused person since I was in my early 20s. It was a whole different skill set to be able to train for endurance. And I did riding my bike before this, and that's what kind of got me the gateway into a lot of these things, but it was entirely different set of skills. And so the big question is, could I leverage these abilities, all the things I've learned, to transform myself as much as I could in a year into someone who could run long distance? Which was really fascinating. And I would say the hardest thing isn't the fact about running fast, because I never wanted to go into this running fast. It was more about managing my expectations, in the sense that when you first start running, especially if you want to go fast and you want to hit a certain pace, you want to just go as fast as you can within the first mile or so. And it's not about that. It's about installing a mental governor to not want to just go all out and negotiating with yourself to either pick up the pace, like, am I being too easy on myself or am I going too hard on myself? can I manage this given the climate, right? If it's too hot or too cold or whichever thing that you might be dealing with is the trick. And running to me is less about the externalities. Those matter to some degree, right? Find shoes that you find really comfortable. And I think a lot of these things aren't really, you can't prescribe them in a cookie cutter sense. You might be able to point people in the right direction, but it's not so much of like this because this is the best, et cetera, et cetera. I would say going into it as the most beginner sense as possible. Start as comfortable as you can, meaning what is the smallest lift you can do, but still pushing yourself a little bit. I committed to running around 3 to 4 miles a day just to build volume, build a base, which means pushing yourself to get your connective tissues used to the strain. And I think part of that awareness is potentially pulling away from the treadmill. If especially if you go to a gym and things like that, is treadmill running is not the same as road running. And running a marathon on a treadmill is just not possible. Or you could do it, but it's just you're not going to enjoy it. It's too monotonous. So I needed to train in as close a way as the actual event, which meant running outside. And naturally, I actually do that better for a bunch of extra reasons, like extra sunlight for vitamin D and just being out in nature, changing your environment. It's just better. You just feel more natural doing that. So that meant I had to get used to running in the cold here in Chicago, which is one, not fun. If you especially I started running around January and it gets pretty cold here. And that meant figure out clothing, layering, gloves, and hat are the most important things. That just comes down to like how your body regulates your temperature. That means your hands, your feet, and your head are what bleed off the most of your heat, especially when you're running outside. And if you can keep those things warm, then the rest of it takes care of itself because you generate body heat as you move. I found that buying Gore-Tex and Merino wool is really good for these kinds of things because it's thin, but also maintains heat and doesn't get like sweaty and then get cold. Because that's the biggest thing is you don't want to sweat and then become cold after the fact because you'll lose your soul real quick and you'll get sick. Hit those 4 miles or so, even on the coldest days at a minimum, then I'm good. And most of my runs outside the weekends were during the week after work, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. Knock it out as fast as possible. Otherwise, it just makes it that much harder to rest and recover. And so it was more about figuring out what works best. I didn't want to become so intense that if I skipped a run, I would berate myself for not sticking to it. It was more of okay, here's the way to maintain a certain level of consistency to feel like some miles was better than no miles. And the other part of this, I think, is you don't have to go out and do sprint runs all the time. If you're trying to do that, you're going to shorten your overall fitness gains because the idea is that if you go out, run as fast as you can, do sprints every day for a week, your body's just going to be so stressed out and gassed that you're going to actually shorten your endurance. And so at that point, you need to figure out how do you maintain your gains, which means what your training cycle look like in a week. And so what my training ended up being more like was doing a lot of zone 2 training because at the time during my first marathon training cycle, zone 2 training was huge. It was becoming super popular and people were rediscovering the benefits of this low and slow endurance. And it hit me at the perfect time to understand what that meant, along with the book, The Comfort Crisis, which had an entire chapter on the benefits of rucking. Rucking is basically just walking with a weighted backpack. And I found that you could get into your zone 2 heart rate by either doing stair climbers or rucking with a weighted backpack on. You can get into it running pace, but it's difficult to find that pace. It's like an awkward stride when you're out in the world. But I think that for optimal health, one of the big takeaways is to improve your overall health, walking a little bit at a brisk pace, anywhere from 1.5 miles or so, and 3 miles, whatever would be that is 30 to 40 minutes of consistent effort is your sweet spot. people who have pets, like dogs, if they walk a dog, that depending on how fast you're going, if you walk a dog twice a day, perfect amount of exercise to hit that zone threshold. This is just ballparks, rule of thumb. It's one of the most interesting things because even though I've trained to perform at this marathon distance, it's given me more appreciation to understand what it means to be functional in a regular human aspect. Because I understand that people are just busy and having as much time. Even for me now, it's like when I think about it, I don't really feel like I want to train for 2+ hours a day and when I would do my long runs, right? For an example, my goal pace was to hit 10 minutes per mile, which is nothing crazy. I'm not going to get to the Olympics being able to do that, but it felt attainable to some degree, or at least it would push me a little bit more to get to that pace and to sustain that over a marathon distance. And from that standpoint, you can understand what it means to push further or less when you start adding more miles to that. So, for example, if you run a 5 miles at 10-minute pace, that's 50 minutes. Now, say you take that up to a half marathon, that is an hour, 2.5 hours ish. So, it's a lot of time to be putting just miles on. And that's the unfortunate thing about running for endurance is that a lot of this just takes time. And because my first time around, it was all firsts. It was the first time I do a lot of these things. You don't have awareness of what that means. And I think now that I've done it a second time, mentally, you leapfrog yourself forward. Meaning, as you build your total endurance and you go from 5 miles your max, and then that's really hard and you're sore. Maybe you back down a little bit. And then in a couple weeks, you go back up. And it's 5, then you're at your peak, and then you back down a little bit. And you go to 10 miles. And you keep doing that and slowly just push yourself forward and back and forward and back and just yo-yo until your peak is around that. I only had done one 20-mile training run. Never done it before. Took me 4.5 hours or something like that when I first did it. And then I go into my first marathon and I don't know if I can do 26.2. I know I can do 20, but it's not fast 20. It's painful. I was totally exhausted after doing that. And so you just hope that your body doesn't fall apart because there's going to be adrenaline. There's going to be whatever factors on the race that you're there. And so when I get to the run, I'm in all the emotions, the adrenaline dump and everything like that. And I'm sustaining a 10-minute pace, but you don't know if you can handle that. And because of the way I did my training runs is I did it all alone. So I don't have a good sense of, okay, this is a sustained 10-minute pace. This is how it's going to feel around a crowd who's all kind of running around you because you feed off the energy of people around you. Okay, I can sustain this. I can follow someone or whatever that is. So the lesson I learned there was that I got it. Like I nailed it for the first 13. It was awesome. Like I was like, okay, training did something. But then around mile 16, the pain hits. And I basically hit this wall of pain. Like my right knee started being painful or my foot felt like I was getting a blister. And it's okay, here it is. Let's see what happens. And it got to this point where I was getting this crazy cramp in my calf. And it was, okay, either I push it and I get a crazy calf cramp and kills the whole thing, or I can back off and walk run it and that's basically what I had to do. And the next day after the run, I was totally sore and totally not destroyed per se, but it was painful, just at the very least. My whole body had been pushed to whatever the limit it is that I could have done in that moment. And I learned a lot. Like you learn so much about what you're capable of. People like David Goggins, who I listen to a lot for these kinds of things, is they say, when you think you're done, you have 40% more to give. And I would think about these things. And it's like when you hear those words, you internalize it and you understand it to some degree, but you don't know what that really means until you really redline yourself, until you really try to get to the absolute limit of what you're capable of. And it could be whatever domain. It doesn't mean you have to go do a marathon. It just find the thing that you want to push to an extreme. And I took a year to train for this both times. And I knew I was going into it because the Chicago Marathon's in October, and you sign up basically December, like right around the time this video is coming out. You basically figure out if you're going to commit to it like that. And I probably had a longer training cycle on average than most people, but that was mostly because of my disposition for things is that I feel like to build confidence, I just need to build a body of evidence. I'm just putting in the work, accumulate miles, little by little, until you get to the actual event and you say, okay, I've done it. And you just figure it out. And I think that in those situations, you really understand what it is. Can you commit to these things? And I know I always go back to this microcosm of working out and lifting. Physical challenges are a microcosm of life. But I think it's so true. It really is, because if you can commit to this, do a marathon in a year, and all the challenges you don't know you're going to face, and how to figure out the different challenges, which is, okay, how do I figure out my nutrition? Like hydration and what does your calorie intake look like? Because like for me, one of the big things was that after a run, I'd just want to fill myself up with calories, which meant I would go to like soda and other kind of crappy foods. And it was like, okay, so that's not good, because I'm just going to start putting a bunch of junk calories in. It might not be that bad because I'm burning so many calories, but it's okay. If I really care, I need to be honest about what kind of calories I'm putting in. Like I need to try to get higher protein. Do I do collagen? Do I figure out electrolytes? Or what do I take with me on the run, and how much can I carry with me that's not like uncomfortable? So it's playing around with different hydration, like water and electrolytes. I think the biggest thing was that just because of Chicago summers are hot and can be brutal. And so just maintaining that balance was useful. Here's how you can think about it to try and structure your training, to try to just do the low and slow cardio, like zone 2-ish. Don't really try to kill your pace unless you're trying to hit a certain pace. But if you're a beginner and you're just trying to be more fit categorically, it's like zone 2 is your best friend, because it's not so intense that you're going to kill yourself and you're going to be so tired the next day that you're going to not be able to function very well. But you're still going to feel like you did something. And then just figure out ways that boost your mood, right? Because I figured out I didn't like treadmill running. And if I did treadmill running, I wouldn't want to continue. So I figured out how to run outside. And I think being outside has a bunch of bonuses with the vitamin D and the sunlight and nature, and just finding trail paths was a huge thing for me. Like we have a bunch of forest preserves around here, so I was able to go and do those things. It was a bonus to be able to be like, okay, cool, I get to go out and be in nature and look at these trails, or just be immersed more in an environment, which was always fun for me. And then on race day, what was really cool here in Chicago is just seeing the city in a different way, because it feels like a big long block party to be all around downtown Chicago and just be energized. And I think the biggest thing to push people to do a marathon at a big city like that is you just get to feel like people are cheering you on, because majority of the time in most of our lives, unless you're a performer of some kind, you don't get a chance for people to feel like you're cheering you on to do something crazy. And again, it's not like most of these people are doing it because they're elite runners or anything like that. Most of these people have to sacrifice a ton of their time and effort and money and take time off to do these things to be able to do a marathon. But it's really different to feel like people are cheering you on to be there and support you to do that. And half these people you don't even know. And, I got to see friends and my girlfriend and stuff like that saw me on my second run, and it was really cool. I think it's one of those things that you get to help people, help you feel like you're accomplishing something crazy and like train for something awesome. And it's like once in a lifetime, like it's a bucket list thing. And it really shows you like, okay, can I this promise with myself, or push myself to this level that I thought was impossible. I never thought I'd do this. A crazy thing to do that. And maybe it's just because I've immersed myself around people like Cameron Haynes and David Goggins, who are insane ultra runners and just gifted runners at that level, that why not? Crazy enough to believe that you can. And you don't know unless you do it, unless you take the first step out the door and just commit to figuring that out. Even though I think that's one of the crazy things about running in general, is you might, some days that you just don't feel like it, or even you might feel like it, but then you get out there and it's a weird feeling where some of the days I feel like I didn't want to go, but then I start running and I feel amazing. I'm like, this is one of my best runs I've done in months. or weeks, the days you feel great, and then you don't feel great at all. And you're like, today was terrible, but you still have to show up. It's similar to what we've talked about in the past in other episodes about the muse, where it's like you have to make the conditions for the muse to show up. So if you're a runner and you want to run well, that means you just have to run a lot. Some days you're just not going to perform well for whatever reason. Other days you're just firing on all cylinders and everything's great, everything's smooth. And it was just awesome. You just hit that Goldilocks training zone or whatever. For me, the big story about that was like the biggest success wasn't even the marathon running it the second time for me this last year. What my biggest win overall was running the half marathon. I nailed my goal pace. I wanted to run a 2:15 half. And when I ran it, it worked. I couldn't get back to that because the weather just got too hot and too intense. So I couldn't maintain the pace that I wanted to. But leading up to it, the conditions were just perfect. It was cool. It wasn't too hot. It wasn't humid. And I could just go at whatever pace I wanted to. And it was when I ran the half, everything just fired on all cylinders. Like my friends had asked me who were running it with me, were like, hey, what's your goal pace? And I said 2:15, and I like nailed it within a couple seconds. Even though I did my marathon faster than I did last time, it was like 18 minutes faster, still nothing crazy. Doing a 2:15 half marathon still is like the most exciting thing about this, because I like proved to myself that I could do a 10-minute marathon and do that. And it feels awesome to do those things. A lot of just learning what your body needs for yourself and how do you just make it work. I'm a little bit at a loss for words because I'm trying to step back from being so specific to just marathon training, because again, I really want to just evergreen this life stuff, because I think that's what it is. It's like learning strategies for yourself to play the long game of life, be successful, and build tools and resilience so that you can perform in the long game. I guess that maybe there's a way to think about this. I'll have to come back after I think about it more, like just in general life advice type thing, because there is like a zone 2 for life, not zone 2 for cardio. Is like a zone, like what's life zone 2? I think it would be interesting to way to encapsulate this, because I feel like you really have to understand what works best for you in the sense. Like for me to be able to do long runs, I think one of the things that made it enjoyable again for me was to put on music or put on podcasts and audiobooks to be able to learn, absorb things. And part of that was like, okay, knowing that if you engage motor neurons while you're listening to something like a podcast or an audiobook helps you learn, because it's like by engaging motor neurons, it gives your body more ways to remember what you're absorbing through your ears, you know. And maybe for some people that won't work, but it was like a way for me to put hours into listening to audio that I found enjoyable. Maybe that's part of why this works for me, because I have the outlet to do intellectual things while immersed in physical challenge. And I like to see what's the texture of my own mind, where I can figure out, okay, where is I'm getting frustrated, or why am I being overly hard on myself for X, Y, or Z reason? Because sometimes you'd have a bad run and you're like, oh my God, I'm trying to do this thing and I can't even run a 9-minute pace or 10 something pace. And you're like, what the heck am I doing? Because you could easily get into that negative spiral where you're like, dude, you're wasting your time to save seconds off of your pace. But maybe that's the game in some sense. Your overall time is not measured by the minutes, but it's by the seconds. And every second you can do it faster adds up to minutes. And so that if I get tired or wanted to go too fast, I would come back to it and lock me in. So I would pay attention to my stride and not get lazy, because being lazy with form means you end up putting stress in places, and tightness/pain could arise if you're not paying attention to that. And it was the slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I always would go back to that, because instead of thinking like I'm not going fast enough, is okay, can I be slow to smooth so that I was being efficient with my energy instead of being like tense and like, because if you watch people who run, is like you want to like scrunch and get like really tense, especially if you're trying to go really fast. And that's not really what you want to do, especially when you're going long distances. Is that leads to weird pains and potentially bad form, or you get sloppy with your form. I am now with 2 of these marathons under my belt. I don't know what's next. I'm not doing it again next year. I haven't committed to it because I wanna do this. I wanna be able to talk about these things in a general way and bring some sort of lessons to people, and life endurance is really what I'm trying to achieve here. So I'll pass it off to you, is now that I've done marathons and people who've stuck with feeding curiosity this long know how much I care about the performance categorically, what resonates with people, to tell you more about the lessons that I might be able to shed light on, or questions you might have, or whatever it might be that helps you. It's good to be back to talk about these things because it's a good outlet for me to be able to get out of my own head. Because if I can step away from it and being hypercritical overachiever, if I don't do something perfect, then it's not worth doing it. But I don't think that's true. Because if I came out here and said it was easy and I expected everything to happen that happened, then clearly I'm not trying hard enough. So I think for this first lessons from the marathon, I'll leave it at that. But I hope this opens a dialogue with everyone else.